All right, everyone. Jessica, do you want to start with introducing yourself and the topic for the webinar today? All right, everyone.
Indeed, let me get my video and my audio back on. Oh, you stopped my video.
Did I?
I think so. That's what it says.
All right, everyone. Well, this is one of these moments we've noticed where everyone needs to, be patient with these new technologies that we have. Jessica, you're back on co-host, so you should be good.
Perfect.
All right.
So, hey, there I am. Hi, I'm Jessica, and I'm here with MJ. We're co-CEOs of Causit Incorporated, and our work in the world is helping leaders and individuals upgrade their thinking for the digital age and get ready to create futures that they're excited about. And cyborg anthropology and digital work life is one of our special areas of focus. So we're offering these webinars this week to help people think through and plan for what the shift to remote work, online events, and all of the other impacts to our sort of business as usual might mean for us. And today we're focusing specifically on the thinking and the mental models that are implicit in our sort of traditional ways of thinking about work and collaborating and communicating and managing projects and all of those things that we spend our time doing. And what might be different about the way that we could think moving forward into being more online instead of in person. So that's what we're going to focus on today. And just as an orientation for everybody with the platform and the way we've got the webinar set up, we are using the Q&A function, which is at the bottom taskbar. So you can enter questions that you have there, and I will do my best to monitor those and hand them over to MJ, who will be presenting in screen share. Also, we'll be quite active in the chat. So if anyone wants to use that to introduce themselves, can chat with each other, and doesn't feel like sort of being on the audio, that works great as well. That's it.
Great. Awesome. So I'm going to go ahead and get us started here, and just reminding everyone that this is also live on YouTube if you want to share with colleagues or friends. I put the link in our chat window on the right. All right, so we're going to jump on in here, and I'm going to share my screen so we can see what's going on. Jessica, you may also need to allow each participant to talk as they join in so that they're able to chime into the conversation, and I'll definitely ask you to manage that while I do these other things. Great. All right, just 1 second while we finish setting this up properly. Share screen, share whole desktop. Awesome. All right, so today is part 3 of our session on rethinking remote and the shifts in thinking for remote work. But before we get started, I wanted to go ahead and show us a little bit about why we're doing this. So rethinking remote work is not something we're doing just because it's fun or because it's, I guess we're going to get around to do this for our companies. If your company has not thought through how to do remote work and is therefore, holding off on going remote, it's a really big issue. And here's why. Right now, we need to flatten the curve. The number of new infections that are happening with COVID-19 are outpacing the capacity of our healthcare system. So it's the job of everyone who can to avoid getting infected and avoid infecting others while we try and catch up with this. We want to delay the outbreak peak and reduce the peak of the outbreak. So the best time to slow the curve is right now. What each of us is doing is pledging to flatten the curve. And if you want to find out more information about that, you can find out about it at flattenthecurve.com. There's a really great Masters of Public Health, Julie McMurray, who's doing a ton of work on there, and I really recommend checking it out. So that's the why of today's session, in addition to the more obvious and perhaps easier to grapple with pieces like, how is this going to affect my company? So there's a way to think about today. We want you to shift from being an audience to being participants. So rather than consuming today's session, please co-create it with us. So the first thing we want you to do is to get comfortable with unmuting. So we're going to take just 1 or 2 sentences a piece and say hello about who's on the call. Of course, you don't have to share anything you don't want to have be in the recording or whatever else, but just what is it that brings you to the call today and what are you hoping to get from it? So with that, I probably won't get to each and every person, but if we can go ahead and get started, get ready to unmute yourself. So if you don't know how to unmute yourself, over in the, at the bottom of the screen, you'll have a mute button that says mute or unmute, and you've been enabled to speak on the call. So with that, I'm going to go ahead and start with David Hill and ask him to introduce himself briefly and model how it goes to, participate rather than just consume the session. So David, who are you and what are you hoping to get out of today?
Yeah, thanks, MJ. I'm David Hill. I'm a consultant, and today I'm helping out Causit in supporting this webinar. And the main thing that I'm really looking forward to is really focusing on how to have the right mindset, especially with everything that's going on in the news and all of our concerns, really how to shift our focus for working remotely.
All right, great. Jean, I'm hoping you'll be willing to introduce yourself. You've been a great participant the last 3 days in this series.
Hi, MJ and Jessica. It's been a pleasure to listen in and also participate. And I'm hoping to continue to learn about ways to help both the social gatherings I'm involved with that I can't participate in right now, communicate better and participate in each other's lives during this quiet time, and also plan for upcoming conferences and public meetings with people that are not experienced with these kinds of technologies. So this is a learn one, see one, do one. So that's, thank you.
Yeah, thanks you. All right, so one of the things that you can do here in this system is actually raise your hand. So if you want to raise your hand to speak or introduce yourself, you can do that. I see also there's some activity over in the chat. So with this, I'm wondering, Carolyn, if you'd like to introduce yourself, that'd be great.
Oh, hi, sure. My name is Carolyn, and I'm actually working at the University of Chicago in a leadership development capacity. And I've been brainstorming with colleagues to figure out how to take what are normally really interactive in-person leadership sessions online. And so I'm just trying to learn as much as I can and help create, maybe help solve that challenge of how to create community and intimacy in a virtual environment.
Awesome, thank you. Yeah, I think you'll also really like the session we did yesterday, which is specifically on how to take large events online, and we'll make sure to make that available to you.
That would be great.
Yeah, definitely. Oliver?
Yeah, hi, it's Oliver. I'm a CTO from NTT Data in Germany. Our company is around 1,700 employees. We are now all moved into the home offices. So we have an enforcement of remote work right now due to the current health situation. And it's quite interesting to see how people cope with it. And yeah, I'm here to get some fresh ideas and also share experiences. And yeah, thank you for hosting this.
Yeah, thank you. So we're not going to have each and every person introduce themselves up front. That might take a while. But what we're going to do is invite you to continue to participate in each and every stop along the way in today's session. And you can use that moment to introduce yourself as well. So today, rather than consuming today's session, try and co-create it with us. Unmute if you need to, use the raise your hand function, chat, or use the Q&A function where you can pose questions to us as panelists. All right, so with that, I'm going to go ahead and talk first about some foundational pieces about what we need to do to be ready for this. Our colleague Mark Bonchek really does a lot of work around this concept of unlearning and how change occurs. And he articulated that change is like a trapeze. First, you need to get people to see that the rope that they're hanging from, their current trapeze bar, is fraying. In other words, that it's ineffective. Then you need to help them see a new bar. In other words, a better way of thinking about their situation. And then third, help them move to the new bar by letting go of the old thinking and adopting the new mindset. Now, here's the thing. No one's going to make a leap across a huge chasm that seems unsafe if they think their current bar that they're hanging from is effective. So a lot of people, I won't talk about this in the context of COVID so much as remote work, a lot of people think that the current way that they work is relatively effective and will translate well to remote. But we know that there's already been challenges in workplaces about how to work with digital technologies and across distance. So things like email and traditional conference calls are a poor substitute for the best kinds of working environments. So what we want people to do is see that the current way of thinking is ineffective. But if we don't provide something for them to leap to, a new model or new way of thinking, they're not going to do it. And we have to model that ourselves before others are likely to do that. So what we want to do is talk through several shifts. Some are relatively large picture, big picture shifts that need to happen, and others are smaller, more specific shifts that help us see the symptoms of our current thinking and how we might need to translate them. At each step, we're going to ask you to participate in the session and pose questions in your environment. So one of the first shifts that we want to take a moment to think about is how we normally think about files and data. We normally think about digital files like data is a thing that we have and it waits for us to modify it. But what we need to start doing is start thinking about digital not as our files, but our company. So if you think of the statement, moving, have a document that you can collaborate on, you may have to, in the long run, actually shift where value is created in your organization. So for Carolyn's organization, I imagine there's a big challenge right now thinking about how you're going to deliver leadership development and organizational development experiences in an online environment. Yesterday, we talked to a lot of companies who are grappling with large events. And how do you have something like a conference where sometimes the best value is in the networking? How do you have that occur online? So what we need to do is to start to shift the way that we think about digital and data, not as a tool we use to deliver value, but actually as the fundamental place that value is delivered. So in other words, it doesn't enable our business, it is our business. So this is one of the first key shifts that people need to think about. I'm going to take a moment to go a little bit deeper on this because this may feel very abstract. So one way that we look at this is thinking about file attachments. There's a file owner who sends or broadcasts a static object, a file like a Word doc or a presentation. What we need to do is to start to think about those as links, where everyone works on the same data or document and always has access to the best current thinking. So I'm curious if any of you on the call are struggling with this right now, where suddenly you're working remotely and everyone's throwing files back and forth on email, and it's kind of hard to know where the current work is occurring. If you have other things you'd like to share about how remote work is going right now too, we'd love to hear what's working or not working in your current organizations. Because we'll continue to evolve this talk as we go through today. It's not a static kind of scripted presentation. So I'm wondering if someone could share a little bit about what's working or could work better in your organizations right now. Might see some stuff happening here in chat. Let me look at this.
Yeah, it says from Carolyn that they've set up shared files, but most people are still used to working in isolation and emailing documents and files.
Yeah,
which is something that's quite common.
Yeah, absolutely. Anyone else?
Yeah, hi, it's Oliver again. Yeah, so in our case, we created some sharing platforms like Confluence, and we see that the adoption is relatively slow, that traditional senior management sometimes is amongst the slower adopters, and that is more the younger workforce driving this forward.
Yeah.
And I would believe that leaders really picking up this kind of communication would really help.
Yeah, I think that one of the things that we've seen, we actually did a big presentation to a German automaker. We were a keynote speaker at one of their conferences. And one of the things that came out in the breakout sessions afterwards was that they had adopted groupware, something that they could use to communicate online on their intranet or in their computer platform. And so one of the things that they ran into is not so much that people didn't know how to use the tool, but that they didn't trust that it was okay to communicate on the same level as executives. So if an executive didn't set the example, no one else was going to do it. So imagine yourself working on a file that's shared live, like Michael's sharing here that last year that you shifted your entire file and server structure to the cloud by a Google Enterprise, and about 90% of files are now collaborative or shared by a link. Gene sharing that keeping track of a lot of co-edited files can be really difficult. So imagine you're working on a presentation to the boss and you see something like this. So, oh, Jessica Long has joined the document where I'm working on the presentation I'm going to give to the boss. So one of the things that comes up with these new tools is not so much, can we have things be shared, but is it okay to have my work be visible as we're discussing and collaborating? Anyone else want to share a little bit about what's going on in your organization? Michael, maybe you'd be willing to share a bit about how it's gone now that about 90% of your files are collaborative.
Yeah, sure. It's been great. I think, we're, to give you guys context, we're an independent marketing agency with offices in Baltimore, Philadelphia, Los Angeles, and New York. And switching to Google for Enterprise has allowed us to really be a lot more productive and collaborative. Given what we do, we work with Adobe software to create creative files, and that platform, that Google for Enterprise, allows us to kind of store those same files in the cloud as well, and kind of work in a way on those files that's very similar to kind of like a Google Google Docs kind of scenario.
Yeah. Yeah, this is one of the things that comes up a lot of times for people. It might be one thing to put files where others can see. It's another thing entirely to be in a file at the same time as other people where you're both editing. Do you type on top of each other? Do they see you make typos? Like, how does that go, right? So that can be really challenging. And that, the first thing that might happen is not so much that you get adoption of these new tools, but you get a lot of collisions, and it can be very challenging. So when we look at this piece where someone's joined your file, or you're doing something like that, what you need to start to think about is there a place where we can all work and have our own spaces? So yesterday we talked a little bit about online whiteboarding software, and what you're seeing right now is one of our online whiteboards around the future of automobility. We had done something to demonstrate to a client all of the interconnections of concepts and why it wasn't as simple as just talking about a piece of software they needed or something else. So we said, well, we could write a long document that they're never going to read, or we could make something that's maybe not so linear. So one of the shifts that has to start to happen when you think about online documents is shifting our thinking away from linear production of value and linear production of if you want to focus it, the document itself. So instead of one person creating it and another presenting it and then the boss reviewing it and then going back to version 2, this kind of thinking can sometimes happen live all in the same place. And it can be incredibly unsettling for people who don't really feel super safe in their work environment anyways, and especially right now if they're concerned about their jobs. So when you start to roll out new technologies and this new remote working, you need to focus on not just the tool set, but the way of thinking that's implied within it. Another example of this is using emails versus chat. So if you think about email, it's basically writing a letter. You're composing something until it's pretty much perfect, and then you send it and you can't change it. A lot of times this is why people don't get around to communicating key things in the organization, because they're trying to find the perfect message. If we shift to something as simple as chat, what we start to see is that conversations happen live and are bidirectional. And in addition to being bidirectional, there's this implication of it being a bit more casual. Now, you can't do this in every environment, but a lot of times you can roll something like this out and start to get some new direction or new communication happening. The next is thinking about direct messages. So let's say you do chat. Most of the time we think about chat as a better version of email or a faster version of email. So like the first thing that we use text messaging for is kind of like sending these little bulletins that look almost like a memo or a letter. My mother, and I'm not using the mother as tech kind of analogy here to say, oh, moms don't get it, older moms don't get it. That's actually not true. My mom's been a very early tech adopter. But because she was an early tech adopter, she never had one of those text messaging phones where you had the, T9 or whatever it was, where you just had the numbers and you had to go through and you use very short messages. Her first phone that had texting also was the smartphone. She had a Trio that she got, a Palm Trio. And so my mother has never learned that texts are short. So she's always just created these emails that she sends to me on text. And so what we start to see is that the mental model that someone uses a technology for will start to change how they work. So when we start talking about chat, a lot of times what happens on chat is just going directly to communicating one-on-one or sending a faster version of an email. But one of the things that's really powerful about chat is actually having channels where you work on topics and you come in and out of the conversation as needed. If you're really with it, you'll use threads for sorting and finding trends in the conversation and making sure you don't clutter big picture channels with the details of a particular topic. So I'm just curious, how many of you are using chat regularly in your organization right now? And especially curious about how is that taking place between people of different authority levels in the organization? Oliver says we do a lot. I would hope so as a tech company. You never know though. Michael, when you rolled out, what you're doing for Google Enterprise, did you all also roll out a chat system?
Yeah, so we use Slack, which is great. And we're actually kind of at the state, and I think we've been using that for, I don't know, 2 or 3 years.
Yep.
But we're now at the stage of the Slack usage where we recognize that maybe sometimes you can have too much of a good thing.
Yep.
So we have a subset working on, okay, let's start to develop some best practices for the usage of Slack. To your point, I mean, it's not just how you communicate and chat, but how you organize. So I would say we're not great about using threads, and that would likely be something we're going to kind of coach our staff up on.
Yeah. Yeah, absolutely. So we use Slack as well. And, it looks like Carolyn's saying that she's using Slack too, but maybe not as much engagement from the senior departmental level. So, in our organization, we use chat that is based around channels that are for particular topics. So for example, you'll see on the left here that we have these channels that correspond to particular topics. So we have one for content, we have one for cooking, so people can have those side conversations. We have one for document management, and they all function differently. So the content channel is for big picture things about content we're creating. And so you can see David and Jessica and some other members of our team were collaborating recently on an article that is about rethinking online events. And there were some specific details that people needed to get into about this last message. You may not be able to read it, but the last message in the main window says, how can people access past webinars? Someone just asked for access to this one. And when I tried to register through Zoom, it brought me to an uh-oh page. So over on the side, instead of replying in the main channel, we did something where we replied to a thread. Now, if you've used Facebook and you replied to someone's post, you've experienced a thread. And if you've used Facebook, replied to someone's post, and then replied to a particular comment, that's yet another level of thread. Threads are really important because they're like side conversations, but when you do things in the open and there's a lot of people operating at once, it can be very hard if people are effectively talking over each other. So you don't want the same channel to have big picture things and then a ton of details right afterwards. And maybe people talk for 30 or 40 lines about details of where this particular webinar recording is. But if you were scanning through it the next day, you don't need to see all that detail. So this is where using threads is a new mental model that you need to correlate to the existing mental model. So we talked before about the trapeze. The way that people normally think about things in work sessions is, okay, we're going to have a committee meeting or a work group meeting or an action meeting, or we're going to have a design session or something like that. So you want to find the tool or the language that your organization used in the analog setting, in person in the office, and find a digital corollary to it. The other thing, to Michael's point, that is really important is to think thoroughly about what each of the channels are for. But don't try and be too regimented about it up front if you can help it. Let things evolve and bubble up, and start with a few channels on key topics and then let them branch out. One thing that we found is we have a content channel, but we also have a website and design channel, and we have a tech channel. Well, a lot of those overlap. So what has happened in habit over the years is that website and design ends up being production, where we have a lot of churn and a lot of tactical things going on. And then the content channel tends to be pretty big picture about our strategy or key releases of content. And the tech channel is incredibly specific. Yesterday in our session, we talked about thinking styles and the different kinds of thinking that people might bring to particular kinds of problem solving. And we found that a lot of times the channels we use in chat actually correspond to particular thinking styles. So we found that the website and design channel corresponds especially to detailed production-oriented conversations, whereas the content channel ends up to correspond more towards big picture, explorer thinking, and maybe planning. So that kind of meta thinking, the thinking about the thinking, is really important to do as you roll out new channels. Because look, you have an opportunity right now to reshape the way the organization communicates, or at least just improve it a little bit. And if you don't upgrade the thinking, but you introduce new technologies, what you're going to get is the same thing you had with email. What was the first thing we used email for? More advertisements, more spam, more chain letters. We didn't really actually have any big breakthroughs around it until it had been around for a while. Same thing with the internet. First thing we used the internet for was more research and more broadcast journalism or something like that. It wasn't until almost 20 years after the World Wide Web really came into being that we had the massive upsurge in the social network kind of concept, and social networking in the social internet became something altogether new. Anyone else have best practices that they've had? Oh, Jessica has a hand raised.
I do. I just realized I'm not able to raise my hand in the chat like everyone else is. So
Because you're a panelist.
I'm gonna do it old school style. Yeah, I just wanted to say the best practices piece is a great point in a much longer conversation. And I wanted to let everyone in the call know that one of the cool things that came out of yesterday's session is that some of the attendees requested if we could set up one of these online whiteboards for people to continue to follow up on the conversation with each other. And so that's just getting started. We'll create one for today's session as well, and you will all be invited, and that will be public, so you'll be able to invite others into that space as well. And we just this morning decided that we will try to stand up a Slack channel for these conversations to happen so that it's more conversational as well, to be a companion to these Miro boards. So things like sharing best practices of what those of us have succeeded with and also have been not so successful with in actually using some of these apps. Ironically, that's something that we will host for you all and your networks in Slack moving forward. So keep your eyes open for those invites in your email inboxes after this call.
Great. And at the same time, I'm going to go ahead and exit our screen share just for a moment to check to see if we have any comments over on our YouTube live streaming. And this is kind of a new experiment for us as well. So I want to make sure that you know, we're doing our own best practices here and making sure we're listening to the chat windows. Nope, no one said anything over here yet, but still cool. All right, so back to sharing screen on this presentation part. So what I want to talk about next is this other element of this, which is that most of the time our emotional bandwidth happens live. It happens in a hallway or a meeting. You can read someone's expression. And one, as we go into video conferencing and tools like that, it takes something to make sure that you're present, you're looking at the camera, you're engaging in the same way. But also, there's a lot of things that happen outside of a meeting, these kind of serendipitous or casual interactions that let people know that, hey, I disagreed with you in the meeting, but we're still good because you smile at them in the hallway. You don't need to unpack everything. But when you shift into a remote workspace, it is really important to create room for emotional connection and bandwidth. So one of the things that we think about is that emotional communication is absent unless you add it. Now, many of us have heard of emoji. If you haven't, go check it out. But remote work actually really benefits from a specific kind of emoji that we call Reactmoji. And I don't mean we personally as Causit, but you know, people who use Slack and others really get into this. So if you've used Facebook and responded with a smiley face or something like that to someone's post, that's called Reactmoji. So you want to think about if you're using a chat tool, especially if it's an older generation of chat tool, can you really emphasize some kind of emotional bandwidth while you're working? Literally, I have a reminder that reminds me to say, hey, you know, say something kind and acknowledge one of your teammates at various points during the day. And the reason is because I can get hyper focused on the documents and be reacting to things and editing and providing tactical feedback. And I forget to do the thing that I would do on a break and say, thanks, I really appreciate what you were doing in the meeting yesterday or how that conversation's going. It's actually probably been one of the hardest parts about us working remotely as a team, which we've done for about 7 years now, has been to really make sure that we keep the emotional bandwidth. So I'm wondering if some of you who are on the call could share a little bit more about what you're doing to have emotional bandwidth occur while you're working remotely. Or if you have a question about how to do the same, that'd be cool too. John says, thank you, Jessica. Hands gesture.
Yeah, exactly.
Because Zoom doesn't let us. Yeah.
I've been really frustrated with that, actually, with the chat. I keep wanting to go over and give thumbs up and, you know, little cool sunglasses emojis to people's comments because I'm so in the practice now. And one thing I wanted to add on that from us is that what I've noticed, especially when people are posting about things that aren't in my work stream or I don't actually have to respond to, it's been really nice to get into the practice of realizing like, oh, that like update on this project status, they don't need me to respond, but I can just add something to there, you know, a thumbs up or a smiley face, that there wouldn't really be much for me to say. If I just said, you know, thank you, that would be weird. They're not actually talking directly to me. It's not my work project. And so I actually feel like the emojis give me the ability to stay connected or give that encouragement where that space wouldn't necessarily occur as an opportunity if I was just CC'd on an email, for example. So in that way, I think it actually really builds that culture of just acknowledging each other's work.
Yeah, it can be kind of vulnerable to do this and to share in these kind of settings as well. Because if we're used to having very subtle, nuanced cues that play with politics and whatever else, and we have to be more explicit about it, if you're in a workplace where that's not normal or exists in a culture where that's not normal, it can be really challenging. David, I see that you had your hand up.
Yeah, I wanted to share sort of two things that I think can really help with this idea of emotional communication and connection. The first is that, you know, in my virtual meetings that I've had that I think work really successfully is actually taking the first 5 minutes or so to really just check in with people in a very much more conversational sort of approach. Because you don't have that face in the hallway time. You don't have that, like, you know, where you can check in with them throughout the day. I think it's really important to do that, sort of have that emotional check-in in the beginning, and then to get onto the agenda for video meetings, or video conferencing. The second tip I'll sort of add to this, especially when you have an active Slack or messaging environment where you do have, you know, communication like the Reactmoji. Also, what I try to do is bridge that into the video conferencing. Like I really try to make a point of saying, and I've seen others do this really well, that like, I saw that thing you posted last night. I haven't reacted to it yet, but I've read through it and I understand it. And building that bridge between the face-to-face that you're getting in video conferencing and what's actually happening in your messaging, I also think is an important way, making sure that people feel like they're seen and that it creates more of that continuity between the different interfaces that you may have. And I think that's really important for people just to maintain that emotional connection.
Yeah, I mean, if you can't see that someone's working hard on a presentation after hours, you know, there's two things that happen there. One, you need to notice it if you can, but the other thing is, if you're the person working late, you may not be the type of person who normally would draw attention to working hard, but you may need to make it visible so that you're working. And this is, you know, for some people, it's a nice to have to share about that kind of stuff. For others of us, there may be some people who are really worried about their jobs and if they're creating value right now during this remote time, and they may be really concerned. So now is a perfectly all right time to make sure it's clear what you're working on. You don't need to brag about it, but just to point to it, say, hey all, here's the link to the presentation that I was working on last night. I made some good progress on it, not quite ready for everyone's review yet, but if you have ideas, let me know, or expect to hear from me soon about this. Because it's not like all of your coworkers are walking out the door and saw that you were still hunched over your laptop typing furiously at 6 p.m. when they're all heading home to eat dinner, right? They don't have that context to see what you're working on. So you have to do it from both sides. We call this taking 100% responsibility, right? David's talking about taking 100% responsibility for making sure that he knows what other people are working on. And as the person who's working on that thing late at night, you need to take 100% responsibility for knowing other people are seeing your work. Because normally you kind of just meet in the middle and it would work out. That doesn't work as well with remote. Anyone else have great practices that are emerging about emotional bandwidth or emotional communication during remote work or during this stressful time?
I think what helps, this is Oliver speaking, is that you share some of your context, because everyone is working from home. So what does your home look like? Maybe switch on your video camera if it's not too embarrassing in the moment, or maybe share about your context or how you are carrying on with your daily life. So usually calls right now start with a short chat on the Corona situation, on how you're impacted, on what kind of creative solutions you find. And I think that helps to connect and kind of replaces the chit chat you have during coffee breaks.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
Yeah, very much. And you know, one thing we've noticed just with our own team is that when we don't have those, we tend to interpret each other's texts and chats and emails in this sort of increasing curve of severity. So the longer that it's been since, you know, a pair of us or a group of us has had that kind of personal conversation, the more austere the text communications can land. Because in especially when we're busy and people are really trying to be very productive, the conversation in Slack or email can become very terse, very concise, just focused on exactly what you need to communicate, what are the results, asking pointed questions about when things are going to be ready. And if you don't have that water cooler time, so to speak, then you start to be like, oh, you know, MJ's really a jerk today. Why is he so grumpy? Or like, oh, this person's really hunting me down. They must not believe I'm working hard enough. Like you start to sort of imbue these like kind of rough interpersonal contexts that may not even be there at all. But because we don't have facial expression and voice tone and that sort of connected time, it's just very easy to get into that mode just as human beings. You know, we're primates and we really need that social context in order to be at our best with each other.
Hey, Jessica, it's
Mike.
Mike. I just want to. Yeah, I just want to double down on what you're saying. I had this instance happen last year where I would reply to people on Slack with just literally a K, like the letter K. And we were having a moment, I don't know, we were out for drinks or something like that. And they shared with me that they viewed that as kind of rude. Mm-hmm. And so now what is acceptable though is if I give a double K, so a KK, they understand that the intent is positive and it's not meant to blow them off or anything like that.
Yeah, in open source software communities, they often just say ACK, A-C-K for acknowledged. Mm. So, and actually there's some languages where you're supposed to acknowledge each and everything that people say. So for example, in Ukrainian, every time someone says something, you're supposed to say something that lets them know that you heard them. And so whether it's an or there's a particular word for that, and a lot of people on our team just do it with a Reactmoji. They give a thumbs up or a donut or a unicorn or a poodle or whatever to whatever they've heard. And it pretty much means I saw this more than anything else. All right, Jean, you go next. And then we have maybe St. Kim will share a little bit as well.
Jean, sorry, forgot to unmute.
Perfect.
Yeah, it's one thing I've found, and I'm not as adept at the social media technology as many of you are, but kindness goes a long way. Just the basics, thanks, please, you're welcome, with appreciation. And another, and maybe it's because I spent so long in public meetings with sometimes contentious, sometimes boring, rarely thrilling, but just making sure that everybody gets heard and making sure that everybody gets acknowledged has been a real foundation for how I try and communicate now. One last piece is I learned just a short time ago about not using words like no but, or and using more transitional phrases like yes and although, those kinds of phrasing. And maybe that's a little too long for the short communications, but
no,
it
we
really
use that
does
all the time.
Get you feedback. And that's it.
I see Carolyn has a hand up as well. That is still currently muted. Okay, great.
Oh, yes. Okay. Sorry, you caught me off guard. And one thing I've been noticing, because while at our organization, people are used to dialing in via doing webinars for meetings and things like that, this is probably the first time we're actively managing projects, trying to design when nobody's in the same room. And what we found helpful is to always go back to some of those basics about clarifying roles and responsibilities and expectations and norms, and how are we going to, like, just resetting them in this virtual environment, but some of those classic rules about how to manage teams or how to be a, how to be a good teammate, they all still exist, but people seem to forget about them in the virtual space.
I'm using my robot desk here to give my body a little bit of a break and stand up. Yeah, so absolutely, those are perfect fits. So, with that, we're going to go ahead and talk about what does it mean to have an even richer set of emotional bandwidth online. And the reason is not to suggest that everyone go to these new tools, but actually to show that they are out there and use it as a bit of a future pool. So there's a tool out there called Verbella that creates this online office space, or the online office experience. You can create campuses, you can create large events, and you can see who's in the room and walk around, and you can find out who else is on campus if you set up a campus as your social context. So one of the things that we're going to talk about later this week that I'd also like you to start thinking about right now is, what is the social architecture or social context that you would like to create for your online offices? So if you think about your physical offices, you may have a break room and a meeting room and a executive office or whatever. You can think of the rooms that you have or the spaces you have. What is on your corporate campus if you're that large of an organization? And if you're a small business, this may be your opportunity to create your dream office. So what we want you to do is to start to think about online spaces as having many of the same qualities of physical spaces. What tone, what level of formality, how often are they used? How full are they? And so as you're starting to set up channels in Slack, or even just email distribution lists in a really traditional organization, start to think about what is the social setup of each of those channels. The other thing that you want to think about is, have you developed some habits in your organization that are going to bleed over particularly poorly to remote work? So I think of one as the work then present. So the first one, this first existing mental model, is that an individual or small group works and then presents to someone in the hierarchy. Maybe someone hired to them, it may be to a peer, or it may be to someone that reports to them. But you get questions like, well, who owns the file? Or it's my version versus yours, or I'll get it ready to you for review. You'll have it next week. And polishing things to have these kind of perfect responses for multiple reasons right now, one of which is the tools, another of which is that the circumstances around us are changing more rapidly than any of us are used to. What you need to start to do is to think about this in a different way. How can you work in the open instead of trying to work and then present something? So we talked about the channels we use. How can you have everyone tap into the network and see current progress? So instead of who owns the final or the file, or what's the status of this project, just say, oh, check the finance channel for a few updates. So these topical channels, what they're really doing is asking people to work in the open. And a lot of times, even though our organization has been digital for a long time, we slip into these direct messages and we forget to move back to the channel, as it were. So we really recommend that you take a moment to, invite people to work in the open. Is there some way that you can let people know what you're working on and invite them to participate more at the draft stage and before trying to polish things perfectly? This, again, can be very vulnerable and challenging, but it is a really valuable lesson. And it's not to say that you never do something where you create a really polished presentation, but start asking the question, is this the situation where I do these really perfect polished presentations, or is this a situation where I work in the open? Wherever possible, working in the open is also going to help you have some of that emotional bandwidth that you need. One of the ways that you can do this is have project plans and project statuses that you are managing online, where people provide regular status updates. So just where you provide a status update akin to what you would do on Facebook or LinkedIn, you can do it on particular projects as well. So how can you have people say what the current project status is? Now, there's a little bit of a graveyard of projects in our own project management system. I'm being quite vulnerable by sharing that we don't do this perfectly, but there are these practices that we have where, for example, our operations manager will often provide us an update once a week in the status update field in our project management software for her finance projects. And she'll say, are we at red, yellow, or green when it comes to cash flow? How are we doing with receivables? Are people paying us on time? And that's germane to her topics. But she'll also ask for requests for support that she has, like, hey, I need everyone to get their expenses in early this week because we're trying to get something out the door. Or saying, hey, I'm just having a really hard time focusing and working from home. Can someone get on to, do a co-working session with me? So this thing in general that this is implying is a shift from hierarchy to network. So instead of top-down command and control approaches, you want to have a more lateral approach to the organization, where instead of communicating from the top down, you're communicating from the edge of the organization back to the core and then back out to another edge. Now, this is not an overnight transition, and it's not going to happen easily for a lot of organizations. We're not suggesting that it's as easy as flipping a switch. Rather, right now, you're going to experience more network challenges in your organizations than you ever have before. Because the reality is that all organizations, even if they have a strict hierarchy, also have a network. You always know the person over in that other department you can reach out and talk to. And there's kind of these side conversations that are happening. If you don't create spaces for people to have those conversations, at least partially in the open, they're going to happen without whoever's in the center of the organization or at the top of the hierarchy. So you need to start acknowledging that a lot of your tools for remote collaboration are probably not built for peer-to-peer interaction and network relationships unless they're more modern, like Slack is. A lot of the tools like Zoom, for example, that we're using today are not really made for peer-to-peer interaction very easily. It may not be immediately apparent that you can actually message any other participant, or that may have been a feature that your IT department locked out. So we want you to start to think about it from that perspective and see if there's something you can do to broaden the way that you use your tools by first shifting your mindset. Now, I see that there's a Q&A question, but unfortunately it's not showing on my screen. Jessica, do you want to check and see if that's a new one? You're muted.
Oh my gosh, we're all over the place. John has a trapeze insight to share.
Oh, great. John, would you like to share? You might need to unmute yourself.
Just unmuted myself. Can you hear me?
Yes, we can.
Okay, here's my insight on how you can get leverage and mileage out of your trapeze story. It's a great story, and it's a great part to use for just what you said about the network and the channels. So the thing is when you're hanging on to that trapeze bar, step one, you're not willing to let go. That's mean you're working so hard, so fast, and you can't focus on that other bar at that time. So when you tell that, everybody on your team, your company knows you're hanging on to that first bar. The next part is in your working on your proposal or the thing, it may be the net. You need a safety net. So when you just say net, then everybody knows that you may need help in finishing your proposal. The third part is if the team doesn't see I'm at the first bar, the net, leave me alone because I'm getting ready to go to the third bar. And then when I get to the third bar, I'll release it and let it go to you.
Yeah. Yeah, I really think this piece about being transparent about that you're going through a change and you're trying on new mental models is really important. So Brene Brown is an internationally acclaimed researcher on shame and vulnerability, which are basically the worst topics to possibly bring up in a corporate context, or most small business contexts too, frankly, but really important right now because a lot of people are ashamed to admit that they never actually learned the new tools and they've been doing the old thing a long time. Or they maybe are embarrassed to say that they don't know how to navigate this or that they are at a loss for what to do next. If you have a position of authority or some social capital to spend, in other words, hey, you're well liked on the team, it's okay for you to take a few risks, it's really helpful for you to model some vulnerability and humility and curiosity right now. And to Jean's point about civility online as well, one of the other really specific things to do in this is to say, can you assume good intent, right? So a lot of times people are going to mess up online. And like Michael was talking about with the K usage and his Slack channel at work, his team brought it to him over drinks, maybe when they're feeling a little more emboldened to be upfront about something. And so this is a time where you want to create opportunities to ask questions and be curious about what someone's intent was and see if you can help translate that into the new normal of working remotely. So we're at the end of our structured portion of the presentation right now, but I wanted to really give an opportunity for people to ask questions. So what is it that you're grappling with, even if you didn't think it was within the scope of today's call, that you might like to talk about or get some support on today? Practicing vulnerability. Most of you are muted, so keep in mind that we may not be able to hear you. Oh, here's one. So Carolyn talks about creating community virtually. Do you want to go live and chat with us about that for a moment, Carolyn?
Sure. We are getting ready to offer a lot of different classes online, and some of them are more leadership development type classes where there's a lot about showing up vulnerably in the space, trying something new, trying it in front of people, exploring and so within the classroom, they did a lot of work to create trust and to create a safe space for that. And so my question that I'll be pondering probably for the next few years is how do we do that online? Where I mean, I coached for a long time and I was able to create that kind of space with one-on-one clients. But of course, it took a lot of work. It took a lot of intense listening and trust building. But how can we do that for our students? What are some best practices out there? Some suggestions?
I can take that one. I would say the first thing that I would say is many of the things that we've been suggesting, if they're stated with the clear intention of creating that vulnerable space and community, can work very well. So for example, in our Slack install at Causit, we have a specific channel that's called water cooler. And at the top of each channel, there's a description of what is the scope of this channel, what's the topic or range that's appropriate here. And we're very clear in that water cooler should not have work talk. It should not have, reporting about projects or any of those things. It's just a place to be funny, to share what's going on personally in your life. And we really hold that as a space that's for that. And it not only gives people permission to go in and interact that way, but also it encourages them because they see other people doing it. We're modeling it in there. So it really becomes this safe space for that kind of conversation to occur. And then the other thing that I would say is just setting up some structured prompts in those online spaces. So, having the check-in question for the day be something that's more personal or be something introspective. And then the leaders of the group taking the first turn to do the sharing or the check-in from that point of view. So that's something that MJ and I do both in our live video staff meetings. We're a very distributed team, so all of our all-team meetings are virtual. But also in the Slack, sometimes we're traveling and we don't have a real-time meeting. So we'll have our weekly check-in happening in our Slack. And it's quite usual for MJ or I, as the leaders of the organization, to be the first person to answer the prompt, what was the most inspiring thing that happened in the last week? Or what might you be struggling with in your life right now that would be good for us to know so we can support you as a team? Those kind of questions are not unusual for us as the weekly check-in. And then for us to go first and say, oh, my family member's having a health thing, or I'm feeling really anxious this week, that really sets the tone to invite other people in. And I think is an especially good point for you as you're training leaders, for them to be the ones to step forward as an element of leadership in modeling that vulnerability and the value of it within their own teams.
Thank you. It's interesting. I was thinking a lot about the sort of the live online conversations that we'll be having, but it's helpful to think about the fact that there are all these, conversations via Slack that are happening all the time where we can continue to create that safe space for them. So it's not just about what we're doing during that, webinar class or something. So it's helpful to think about it like that.
Yeah, I think that you'll really get value out of the talk that we did yesterday, and we'll be repeating it again next week. And there is a recording of it as well as an article that parallels it. So I think that piece on how to move large events online will be useful. But there's a really good point around how to create online community. And again, it's really just the emotional bandwidth will make a huge difference. The other thing that we didn't mention that's really related to almost everyone's discussions today is hat switching. So if you're saying, look, I'm a human being, I'm also your boss, or I'm also your coworker, or I'm also your client, or whatever, how can you let people know explicitly which channel you're using? So for example, can you be using, which hat you're using? So, hey, I need to put on the hat of the person protecting company finances right now. Might be really useful to have a conversation with someone when you're about to say, look, you know, I don't think we're going to be able to keep our coworker on because we just don't have the funding. And then switch hats and say, look, as her friend, I'm really having a hard time with this right now, and I don't know how to do this. Every single organization we're talking to is grappling with this kind of thing right now. So it's important to not try and have just one facet that you show to people, but to show as many facets of your humanity as you can, the productive sides, the emotional sides, everything. And being explicit about which hat you're using is really important when most communication happens in the same channel. For example, if you're texting with a coworker, is this a friendly text or a where's that deliverable text, right? And it makes a really big difference. We often sort channels based on that kind of hat, but if you can't do that, or even if you can, being explicit that you're speaking on behalf of the company or on behalf of the team, as distinct from how you feel as an individual, goes a really long way to giving you room to have emotional bandwidth and giving others room as well.
Thank you. That's incredibly valuable. I'm going to actually share that with the team after I hang up here. So,
super useful. Yeah, really common hats are friend, coworker, team member, business owner, client. I'm putting on the hat of a potential user or a potential customer, so that you can be clear that you're not arguing, you're imagining what might happen for a client. You know, those kinds of things make a really big difference and go very far distance in making sure that your intent is clear, which is really what that's about.
Yeah.
Thank you.
So I think on that note, we're going to go ahead and sign off. Jessica mentioned in the chat window that our Slack channel info will be in your email inboxes this afternoon, provided we don't have a technical difficulty with it, which occasionally happens, even though, yes, I have a degree in cyborg anthropology, which is a real degree, but I promise it means that the #1 thing that happens is technology messes with us. But so we'll make information about this topic available later today and continue to go. We have a series all week and next week as well. All right. I see that there's a chat message from Jackson too. You might want to take a moment on. All right. Thanks, everyone.
Thank you, MJ. Take care. Bye-bye.
Thank you. Bye-bye.
Thanks a bunch.